The beginnings of the Kieffer family and traditions up through the evolution of Brantingham, Brantingham Lake, New York. A lot of this starts off with going back to in the family tree to a great grandfather who lived in Syracuse, and he and his brother opened up a large business on the main street. This was a large hardware business. The brother took care of manufacturing parlor stoves and hardware, and the great grandfather Kieffer, let's see, this would be a Joseph D. Kieffer the First is his proper name. He was the sort of a outdoor person. He liked mingling and talking with people. He was a people person. And so they kind of asked him if he would be the one to go like a salesman and possibly go out on the road and solicit business from not locally in the city of Syracuse, but outside the city in other places. So he would take trips to solicit, as well as he liked traveling, and he liked people. So somewhere along the line, as the story goes, he ran into, well, I should say this, he was also a hunter. He liked guns. He fell into an era of hunting, especially deer and moose and other animals that were legal, and you could eat their meat. And so this grandfather, Joseph D. Kieffer the First, he had a large family, of which was the firstborn was a girl, and then after that he had 8 boys. And so this was a large family, and he had to support them. So one of the ways to get meat on the table was to go hunting at different times of the year for different animals. So he happened to hear of areas in the North Country that were good for hunting, one of which was the Adirondack Mountains, with all of their animals that they had up there. And so he decided to plan a trip to the Adirondacks and see what the hunting was all about, but also
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. He had to, or he wanted to check out some of the towns, because these villages and towns in the North Country, they probably would like some of these stoves that they were making and could use them. They were kind of a new modern kind of vintage of stove. And so he decided to take a trip. And he was going on this trip, and he wound up in a little town called Gregg. And he was told that there was a hotel, or not a hotel, there was a hunting camp at this lake, which was nearby, and it was called Brantingham Lake. So he went, and with his horse and wagon, he decided to climb the hill and check out this lake, which was up on a plateau of the beginning on the western slopes of the Adirondack Mountains, and it was on a plateau. So he happened to find out that this hunting camp was great, and he said, boy, this would be kind of nice to go hunting. So he made friends with the proprietor at that time, whose name was Mr. Graves, who owned this hunting lodge. Well, then he went back there later in the fall of that year, and because of having been there to Brantingham and seeing what was there, and he said, "Boy, you can go fishing and hunting." So he decided to take one of his boys with him, and this happened to be Joseph the second. So he took him along with him, and they just loved it. And they went hunting. I do not know whether they caught deer or not. They also went fishing. They caught some fish, and they became quite friendly with the proprietor, Mr. Graves. Plus, Mr. Graves needed a stove. It just so happened, and so they became pretty good friends because now my great-grandfather could sell him a stove or two. All right, the story continues that year after year, my great-grandfather, Joseph D. Kieffer, took more of his boys because they were all kind of anxious. They had heard about this lake and all that's up there, and so they made it a yearly thing that they would go up in the fall and go hunting. And as the story goes, for years then he took all the boys up there, except there were a couple of boys in the family because they had 8 boys. And there were a few boys that didn't care for hunting or guns. They were more interested in sports, and so they didn't participate. But those that did, they had a great time. Well, one of the boys, his name was John, and he went with his father one time because he had heard about it and he was curious. And he found out by going with his father that Brantingham was a very beautiful place, and it had a lot to offer in many different kind of ways. And he was curious about the area. And he said, "I'd like to go back there someday," but he didn't. Okay, story goes then that we go into the future farther. This John, who is my father, he decided that if he ever got married, that would be a beautiful place to go on his honeymoon. Okay, let's move ahead in history. He finally did get married, and he decided to come up here on their honeymoon. He married my mother, Mrs. Una Young, Y-O-U-N-G. Okay, that's another story. Okay, so they came up here on their honeymoon, and there's a nice story connected with having all of your brothers kind of giving you the raspberries when you got married. And back in those days, they made a big deal out of teasing you and harassing you if you got married. Okay, so my father and mother, let's switch now and go to my father and mother. And they decided to come up on their honeymoon. And this was back in 1925. So now we're dating. Before that, my great-grandfather came back up, or came to Brantingham for the first time back in the 1800s. Okay, just to give you an idea of date. Okay, they got married, and then all of a sudden they had a child, and the child they named...
Wait, you gotta tell about the handcuffs.
Oh. Okay, let's back up. Let's back
That's
up
the
to
best
the.
part.
Let's go back to when my father and mother got married, which I just finished kind of saying that they came up here on their honeymoon. Well, the boys in the family, my father's brothers, they liked to kibitz and have a lot of fun. And back in those days, different kinds of things took place. If you got married, they'd like to throw a party, and then they tried to prevent you from going together somewhere like a honeymoon. And so my father and mother had to figure out a way to escape. And in order to do that, they conjured up a friend of theirs to take them in the car after they got married and after they had party and all kinds of festivities. They would secretly go out a back door, hop in this friend's car, and he would take them on a little bit of a trip around in the city, because once the brothers found out that they had gotten free out the back door and escaped, they were going to go pursue them. They were going to go after them and find them. Well, they caught up with them somewhere in the city because they had all kinds of lookouts, people who would kind of look for them and try to find them. So my father and mother decided that the best way to break free and escape would be, and this was getting dark now, this is at nighttime, and they were still on the hunt, and they were still running around in this car, traveling around in the city streets. So they decided to elude the brothers that were following them. So they took and went through a back parking lot. And when they did, the brothers that were following were a little bit too far behind because they got caught in a stoplight, because the friend of my father and mother, who were escaping and getting ready to go on a honeymoon from their wedding, they timed it just right. So they pulled up to this stoplight cross section of the city, and the light just changed and they kept going. And the brothers had to stop at the stoplight, otherwise they'd get a ticket. Well, so my father and mother got away just in time to go down a back alley. They got out of the car and they hid until there was no more people chasing them. They had gotten lost. So you know what? My parents decided the back alley was the back alley of a movie theater. And so they decided to go to the movies. This was at 10 o'clock at night. So they decided to get a ticket and go up and sit up in the balcony, way, way up in the back seats of the movie theater. So they watched the movie, and then after that, my father went out and got a taxi. He rented a taxi, and the taxi took them to the train station. They got on the train, and they went, this is the New York Central Railroad train, took them to Utica, New York, from Syracuse, New York. And they got on another train. It went from Utica up through to Watertown. And they got on this train, but they had also made arrangements, because at just about that time, this was back in 1925, they had something brand new in the world called a telephone. It was old-fashioned, but it was a telephone. And so they communicated by telephone to this lodge, but the lodge had now expanded and became a little hotel. And the little hotel was called Brantingham Inn. And that's where they were going on their honeymoon, was this little hotel, which at one time was a hunting camp. It is now a hotel. So they made arrangements, and they had the owner of the hotel, we call him the proprietor, he got his horse and buggy out, and he went down Brantingham Hill and met them at a old railroad station. And the railroad station at that time was a combination. It was a combination of a little railroad station and a whistle stop where they dropped off milk cans from the farmers. The farmers used to put their milk in big cans and put them on a platform, and that was called Burdick's Crossing. The building is still there today. And they got off there and they were met by the proprietor, Mr. Graves, who knew my father, and they got on board a horse and buggy and brought them back up for their honeymoon at Brantingham Inn. They also you got to think back. They also, back when they were traveling around the city and got lost and tried to escape, in order for my father and mother to stay together, my father decided that the best way for them to stay together, because his brothers wanted to capture my mother and take her one way, they would let my father go a different way. So my father decided to buy a pair of handcuffs. He had a police friend of his who had an extra pair of handcuffs, and so they handcuffed themselves until they got on the railroad train and then unlocked the handcuffs so that they could escape. Now my parents are up at Brantingham and they're on their honeymoon, which is a nice thing after you get married to get away and enjoy like a vacation. Ready for next part 2?
Sure. All right, hold on.